the diameter. Okay. If you want to put an A520 or a 568 or a 555 in place of a 525, transmission will physically bolt up. But as a temporary measure, you're going to have to get drive shafts out of an 88, an 89, or a 90 L body automatic, because they went up to this bigger shaft and they are shorter, and the dimensions of that automatic transmission are the same as the 555. You're going to have to get two left side L body 88, 89, 90 drive shafts if you want to put that transmission in your car. Now, also the linkage is all going to get thrown out because the L body uses linkage, not cables. And that transmission, later transmission, is cables. Okay? Now, the ideal thing to do, and I want to show you just a minute after we take a break, on how to center the motor so that this don't happen. And you can maybe make these mamas live. But the ideal way, if you're going to really pump some horsepower to an L body, okay, is to send myself the axles out of the right side of a minivan or a Daytona, and I will shorten them down for you, or Aero Machine Shop up in Garden City, Michigan can do the same thing and give you that strength versus this strength, because even the 88, 89, 90 automatic Omni is still going to have that tripod in it, not this one. Okay?
If you could take your break now.
Sure, let's take it right now. All right, you guys ready? I think you're wearing you're wearing Peter's up. We're gonna do a couple things here with transmission. We're gonna jump into suspension real quick, and we're gonna try to finish up suspension and brakes.
You said something about centering the engine.
We're gonna center the engine. The first thing I want you guys to be aware of, though, is throw-out bearings. And there is a little bit of a difference. This is an early throw-out bearing. It is a constant tension design. This thing does run against the fingers of the transmission continuously, against the fingers of the diaphragm clutch. What did I say?
Transmission.
This is the early design. And a lot of the problems where you have seen wear on the fingers, or the diaphragm fingers, and some of you have pulled down some transmissions, where's Rich yet? He called and told me on the phone. I think you were telling me about it, Roddy. Where you see a lot of wear on the fingers is a result of the way this thing rides on the input shaft's collar. Okay? This thing gets contaminated with clutch material. Why don't you run outside and grab the rest of them guys if you're going to come in, or playing hopscotch or whatever they're doing. The problem is that when this thing rides over the aluminum input shaft collar, and that's its guide, okay, and it pushes down the fingers, this thing gets contaminated with clutch debris, road debris, whatever comes up into it. And what it does, it wears that aluminum housing out, and it gets uneven undulations in it. And then this thing seizes, and it side loads, and it won't go back.
Those are the guys that have to get stuff to eat.
They overcome the food hunger, or what? They'll be tonight, yeah, they'll be screaming tonight that they want to know about throw-out bearings. Anyway, believe me, they do that too.
We'll sell tape, that's okay.
Hey, I got a throw-out bearing problem. Anyway, when you go buy a transmission, the one way you can really look to see if it's wore out or how many miles are on it is pull the throw-out bearing off and then wipe off the input shaft yoke. Okay? And just feel it with your fingers and feel how uneven it is. And a lot of times you'll see that the problem is not the throw-out bearing that's riding against the fingers of the pressure plate, but the yoke is wore out, or it's not lubricated properly, and this thing doesn't slide freely. Okay? Now these things are expensive. They're about 75 bucks. There's several different types. This is the later model design with a little bit better plastic sleeve in it than this one. Okay? You fill these with a synthetic grease. You can replace them, or you just re-lubricate them, however you want to do it. But if you're going to buy a throw-out bearing, buy the one like off of a 568 transmission. This has got a little bit better holding area for lubricant. And use Mobil 1 chassis grease. And that works great. Okay?
The one that Center Force has, do you know which one that is?
You know, Center Force is Center Force. Center Force doesn't sell throw-out bearings. That's a Chrysler throw-out bearing right there. but you'll sometimes see wear on a center force mower, so for some reason, I think it's just because it's been in there for time and ages, and nobody's ever lubricated the throwout bearing on the yoke of the transmission. They just go and pull the transmission out, it's got 100,000 miles on it, throw a center force on it, and then for some reason they have to take the engine apart and they see all this massive wear all over the fingers of the clutch the next time they take it out, and they say, oh, there's something wrong with the throwout bearing, and well, it's supposed to run continuously. And it's just hanging up because it's not lubricated properly. Any questions on transmissions? Sure grips. Okay, sure grips. They are available. They're made by two guys. One is up in Nova Scotia, and the other one is in Massachusetts someplace. The guy in Massachusetts copies the guy in Nova Scotia. They're not true sure grips, they're just tension types. In a 525, they're just pure set of pucks and springs that push against the side gears. And when you get into an A520 or a late automatic or a 555, 568, you can get a set of clutches in it because there's enough room in there to machine them for a set of clutches. But when you have one of those types and you send it off either to Lambros or to Forward Motion or myself, make sure that you specifically specify. I do not want one off your shelf. I want my particular carrier back. Because these guys that have no mechanical knowledge are going to go grab one that's already pre-built off their shelf. They're going to hand it to you, John. They're going to say, here's your differential case. And you as a novice would never know the difference. Those cases vary in dimensions. And you're going to go throw that back in your transmission, and you're not going to know if it's too short in preload or too heavy in preload. And you're going to wipe a transmission out 6 months down the road. Now, you think you're going to go back and blame your supplier because he just pulled one off a shelf and didn't give you your old one back?
Not in this
No,
one.
not in this lifetime. So stamp it some way and identify it. And when you send it to them, make sure that this guy sees yours up there because it's dimensionally tolerant to your case. Because there's not a soul in this room besides Rod, maybe, and I don't even know if you got tools to do that. And it is a monster to go back in and change the preload on a 525, a 520, or a 568, because you got to get that bearing retainer that I was passed around that had the beveled edge. You got a special tool. It's going to go in there and pull that race out. And you got shims that go underneath that race. And it's a monster on a 555 or 568 to go back in and set it, because you got to gut the whole transmission. Because the ring gear is part of the carrier. Okay? But they are available out there. They're expensive, but you know they're there. They're about a 70% lockup. That's all you're going to get. It does improve if you got one of them. Before you go up to the staging lines or you go out and whatever the hell you do, go out there and do a bunch of figure eights in the parking lot with it, because it side loads the side gears, heats them up, expands them a little bit, decreases the dimension, and you will get better lockup. Okay, I got them for neons, whatever the hell you want, for automatics, whatever. Okay, if you run a lock welded diff, better carry a rosary and a lot of holy water. I've run them before where you weld up the spiders. You know, you're at a lock differential. Well, you will put one of those in a front wheel drive car and try to drive it below 30 miles an hour. And boy, you talk about ankle braking, or I should say wrist braking time, because when you try to turn the steering wheel, you're actually winding up the axles. Once you get above 30 miles an hour, it's point and shoot. You know, it is literal point and shoot. But if you ever break an axle, boy, it's figure eight time. You know, so it can be done if you guys want to do it. Let's do brakes, because we can do that short, we'll do brakes, and we'll do it fast, and we'll do it quick. Probably the best brake system that Chrysler's ever had on any car has been the 83 Shelby. It was a system where we had Tevis designed brakes up front, we had 200 millimeter drums in the rear, and we had a distribution block with no proportioning valve. What the hell's a proportioning valve? It's where you got dissimilar pressures that you have to correct with either slope or angle via a proportioning valve, and when you increase the PSI of your pedal or your foot pushing against the pedal, when it reaches a certain PSI, that slope or that angle, we call it in engineering terminology, rolls off pressure. And instead of having 1,500 pounds going to the rear like we had to the front, it adds 2,000 pounds to the front, only 1,000 pounds to the rear. That's what a proportioning valve does. The 83s didn't have a proportioning valve. They just had a metering block. All they did was just, you know, we had an X system. It's left front, right rear, right front, left rear. You don't have a separate in essence, front and rear brake system, like off the master cylinder. Everybody thinks that this side maybe is just the fronts and this side is the rear. This might be left front, right and rear. This might be right front, left rear. Okay, that's the way it goes. When you get into brakes, the 83 had the best system, the best balance system. We had 10.5-inch brakes up front, Tevis 2 pins, which meant that the caliper rode on 2 pins. Good directional control with minimal swept areas. We had full vented rotors up front, 200 millimeter rear drums. When we went to the turbo cars, we got 8x magazine riders again. And we jumped up, we kept the same brakes on the front, we jumped up 20 millimeters in the rear and went up to a 220. Now we don't have a balanced brake system anymore. Now we got to go back and put a prop valve in it. So we defeated what the hell we did in the first place by just saying we got bigger brakes on the car than we did in 1983. Kind of an advertising type thing. We kind of controlled it a little bit by dropping down the wheel diameter size and wheel cylinder diameter size in the back. That is not a real good balanced brake system, the 220s on the back. And later on when we went into the Daytonas, we got even stupider. We threw rear disc brakes on because the magazine riders again said, you guys don't have 4-wheel disc brakes. So we came up with disc brakes for the rear. And the 87, 88 Dodge Daytonas and some of the Sundance CSXs did not have a real good, that was kind of a ratchet and screw type rear disc brake. And its emergency brake was just almost zero in function. Because what you had to do is you had kind of like a ratchet screw that squeezed the 2 pucks together, and it really didn't have a good clamping action because the effort of disc brakes is directly proportional to the foot effort or to the emergency brake effort, and there's just not enough square inch area there to hold the car on any type of incline. So in '89, we went to a drum and hat design. And there's 2 different designs of that. What do we call it? Drum and hat. It looks like Charlie Chaplin's, or what was the other guy that wore the top hat? You take the rotor off, and the rotor looks like a top hat. Because inside the center section of the rotor was a small set of emergency brakes. And that really is the best of the 4-wheel disc brake. That setup you can put onto an L-body if you guys just have to have 4-wheel disc brakes. You know, some guys just have to have that. It's useless because you're so overkill in the rear by keeping the stock fronts on there. You get any type of slip conditions, and this thing is,
Plus they're heavier.
Pardon?
Plus they're heavier.
Plus they're heavier. You know, the only thing you got there is for somebody to look through your wheels and say, oh, it's got 4-wheel disc brakes, you know. If you're going to do any kind of an upgrade to the brakes, the Tevis was the original design. 54 millimeter pistons. A little bit better brake package that we swung to for serviceability on our 86 road race cars was we swung over to the minivan, not the minivan, we swung over to the early Daytona Kelsey Hayes, which looked like this. 1 pin. And it was 54 millimeter pistons again. And it looked very similar to this, but the nice thing about it is when we ran a 24-hour race, now we could get the rotors off. Because on the Tevis system, this particular adapter back here had fingers that came down. You couldn't get the rotor off. You guys have done it on your all-body cars. Rotor's gone bad. Well, you got to break those 2 18-millimeter bolts.
Oh, and they're Loctite.
Oh, and they're Loctited on. Oh my goodness, you say all kinds of unchristian words. To get this adapter off, to take the rotor off. Okay. So for simple serviceability, we just had different suppliers for different cars. This was a 54 Kelsey Hayes setup that has 1 pin. Okay. But we increased the brake pad swept area by almost 25% because it had bigger and better pads. So for the road racing, we switched over to those, and we kept SCCA confused because they didn't know what the hell was going on. Later on, when the minivan came out in '87, they came out with a brake similar to this. But this sneaker's 5 pounds heavier, and this is unsprung weight. And unsprung weight definitely correlates to horsepower loss if you increase it. Heavy wheels are almost as detrimental as shooting water down through your intake system. Okay? It doesn't make horsepower. Unsprung weight is detrimental to performance. So we said, my God, we'd love to have these things on because these are great. These, we jumped up to a 60 millimeter piston, okay? 4 millimeters bigger than the 54s. We're up to 60s. 4 millimeters times 40, a millimeter is 40 thousandths. Think about it, 4 times 40, 400 thousandths, almost a ½ inch bigger piston, okay? But we used again, the phenolic resin piston. Terrific for warranty. Light, lighter than that particular stainless steel part. Light, doesn't corrode, okay? Does a tremendous job of dissipating heat, but you throw heat from the shoe against its surface area and it'll crumble like a cookie. And I'm talking about right here where the shoe contacts, okay? So if this thing crumbles off on one side, then you've got uneven side loading of the shoe trying to, push up against the rotor. The second problem with the minivan brakes is these things were never designed for performance. That's its cooling port right there. That's when the rotor sits underneath here. That's where the air has to get out. How's the air going to get out of that thing? This thing is designed for 3,500 pound vehicle. Mama's driving it. Phenolic resin pistons, and without a lot of work on this thing. Plus, it's 5 pounds heavier than the 54 system. But with the 220 rear drums now it brings us back into the proper brake proportioning that we lost on the 83 Shelby. How do we make this thing work? We sit down on an end mill and we take 5 pounds out of it right there. You think that hole's a little bigger than that hole? So we equated the weight. So we're back where we started. We don't have a horsepower problem now, okay? We got a piston that's 6 millimeters bigger. And we got a phenolic resin piston that won't take racing. So I make those out of stainless steel. But there's a compromise to this. This is going to absorb more heat than this. So I sit down and I ceramic coat them on the inside so that they won't absorb heat. So if you want a good brake package, okay, this is a brake package that will make your CSX, whatever, into a competitive race car machine. Now, an easy upgrade on rotors is to go buy the minivan rotors. They're twice the cooling fins. That's the fins that we actually, those minivan rotors are rotors that we had designed through Kelsey Hayes. They were actually used on the road race cars. And they get this, go up to the parts store, you buy it for 25 bucks. And they interchange on any of your L-body cars or even your Daytonas or your CSXs or whatever. You just say, I want a pair of minivan rotors. For an 84 through a 90. That's the year frame. 84 through 90. And compare them by looking at the cooling fins, okay? And you'll see that they have twice the cooling fins and twice the metal mass, and they dimensionally interchange with the earlier style.
Stock
car
brake
rotors.
setup.
Pardon?
Stock brake setup?
Yes. They're bolt-on. Best improvements you can do. When you go up to these 60s, you're gonna, and another thing on the L-body too, you may get a lot of pedal travel. Even a stock L-body's got a lot of pedal travel. They only use a 21 millimeter master cylinder. 21 is 7/8 of an inch. Anything else other than an L-body is 24 millimeters. That's 1 inch. Okay? That's still not enough to compensate for that big a system. You got to go to a truck master cylinder. This is off a 93 back Dodge truck. It purposely won't fit. Even though it dimensionally fits here, this is 27 millimeters back here, 1 1/8 inches. They purposely made these tubing flares a different size so that inadvertent mechanics wouldn't grab one of these things and put it on an L-body. And when you put on the brake, grandma's through the window, So you got to find these tubing adapters right here to convert this thing back down to 3/16. Or you got to go out to a junkyard, get the tubing flares off of a host car and redouble flare it if you're adverse to doing that. Or I should say, versed to doing that.
What about a caravan mass cylinder?
Still 1 inch. Even though they've got 60s on them, it's the way the fulcrum movement of the pedal is. They like it. They just feel like they have a lot of pedal.
What year are those cylinders?
83 back. I'm sorry, 93 back. 93 back. 93 back. It's a little bit bigger in the reservoir here. It's a direct bolt up, and you'll have to call me. I buy these from the vendor that makes them from Chrysler. These are, and I buy them for, God, 1/4 of what you guys would pay for them at a parts store. So if you need one of these, holler. And these are special adapters that convert it down to 3/16. But this gives you a really beautiful brake package. I mean, this makes that thing stop. Hell, I used it competitively in racing for a long time. And that was one heck of a brake package. Yes.
With the stock brake setup, will that show you including the put the master over that?
This would, on a stock brake setup this here, you wouldn't even be able to move the brake pedal. This would make it so hard, you would be Alan going through the windshield. You definitely-
Caravan one.
Any questions on brakes? Now, one thing I didn't show you
One
is,
question.
yes.
You're gonna tell us how to break in pads?
Oh, yes, there's a way to break in pads. Brake pads got to go through pressure and heat cycle. And you're going to laugh when I tell you this now, okay? Because you're going to make them smell. You're going to say, Peter's is crazy. I had them call me back on the phone and say, I'm going to sue you. You told me the other day, no, you, don't turn around, that you went out road racing, and all of a sudden your brakes now feel real spongy and so soft. Probably what you have done is you have overglazed the shoe because you didn't properly burnish it, heat cycle it, okay?
Road miles on it.
Okay, but what you've probably done is the adhesive that's in the shoe that holds the composite together is probably migrated to the surface, glazed the surface of the shoe. And physically what you're getting is not a soft pedal, you're getting a shoe that's not frictionally stopping against the rotor. Because it's glazed and it's glassed off, okay? The adhesive in a brake pad is called plasticizer. It's anything that makes anything flexible, okay? And when you heat it up enough, it's got to go through a proper thermal cycle of curing the pressure. So I'll never forget a time I told a guy who was a big road racer, I said, you got to go through heat and pressure to cure your brake pads. So he still lives with his mom. This guy now is a 747 pilot, by the way, okay? And you think that guys that fly big airplanes like that have some sense. Matter of fact, his daddy was an astronaut. He lived down the street from him. And so as he calls me back on the phone, he said, boy, you got my mom pissed. Why? He says, well, I got the brake pads in the oven and they're really stinking up the house. Got brake pads in the oven? He says, yeah, he says, I got them in a vise. He said, I put the whole vise in the oven. He says, man, he says, the grease and all that shit on that vise has really got the house stunk up. But wow. Anyway, that's not pressure cycle, okay? Let me go through how to burnish and how to seat brake pads. Whether they be stock or whether they be Hawk blues or blacks or, what's the other one that's out there? So there are different names of racing brake pads. If I can, excuse me offhand. What's that again? Carbon metallics.
Bendix says
Okay.
titanium metallic.
And Bendix has got titanium metallics. Okay. Even a stock set of pads, I can make a stock set of pads, probably go through 2 26-lap road races. Okay. That's almost unheard of. But if you heat cycle them right, they do work. And they will have a tremendous more frictional coefficient in stopping. We used to do it when I was with these guys, because we had a deceleration meter that we used to have over on the seat. Okay? I think that's what was in out that vapor bucket, wasn't it? Or what the hell was that thing?
That was something else.
That's something else.
We've got to sell around.
Anyway, yeah, the sell them, yeah. But anyway, basically think of this as a cup of coffee sitting on the seat. And you're going to be at about 60 miles an hour. And you're going to put on the brake pedal sufficiently hard enough to where that cup of coffee would pretty much fall on the floor. Bingo, right now. You're going to decel to that point. You're not going to put it through the windshield, but you're going to put on the brake pedal with enough pressure to where that cup of coffee sitting on the seat would fall on the floor. Okay? So you're going to take it down to about 20. You're going to stay in 4th gear. You're always going to be in 4th gear, or you're going to be in drive. Then you're going to let off, and you're going to give it about half throttle, and this is your cooling off period now, to go back up to 60 again at about half throttle. And then when you hit 60 again, you're going to go back on the brake and take it back down to 20 again. You're going to do that 25 times. You're going to kind of do it in a loop on a service road to where your last 2 or 3 times you're fairly close to the house or wherever you're going to park this car, about a 12-hour period. And what you're going to do is you're going to bring this thing's going to be stinking and it's going to be smelling, and you're going to bring it back in and you're going to park that mama and you're going to stay with it for about 15 minutes. And when we're out on a road race course tomorrow, you're gonna do this to your own cars. I'm gonna teach each and one of you to do it. Because when you work them brakes hard, what's the hot spot? The caliper. Against that particular spot of the rotor. And what you're always gonna do after you performance race one of these things, you're gonna leave the car in neutral, and you're just gonna walk up front, kind of just sit on the hood for just a couple seconds, and you're gonna gently move the car back about 3 feet. And then you're gonna walk around the back of the car. You know, by the time it gets back there, you're gonna gently move it back a couple feet so that that hot spot of that caliper is always sitting on a different side of the rotor. For about 15 minutes. How you cool down a horse? When you ride a horse hard, you gotta walk them and cool them down. The same way you gotta roll a car, you gotta cool down your brakes. Now, after you've done that 25 cycle bit, it's vitally important that you let it cool down and walk it back and forth for 15 minutes and then let it sit for 12 hours or take the brake pads off and let them thermally go back to total ambient temperature and do their molecular metamorphoses or whatever the hell they do chemically to the adhesives that bind everything together. Okay? That is the proper burnishing of a brake pad. And if you do it any other way, you ain't gonna live, and you'll create a phenomenon probably like what you've got. And there's no correction of what you've got. You're gonna probably have to wind up taking your brake pads off, chuck them. Because there's not much you can do to fix them. Okay? Now, a couple other things you do to brake pads is you always sit there, and I want to pass this around. You always sit there with a grinder and you always bevel these edges and just cut them off. And look at the inboard shoe. On these particular brakes, there's all kinds of springs and crap that keep them from chuckling. Okay? I sold a set of brakes to a guy. He says, I want a set of brakes that'll stop on a dime. So I sent them to him, and he says, I'm driving along, the curbs, and I can hear the outboard shoe rattling. Well, yeah, because they take all the silencer springs off of it. And if you just want them silent, there's all kinds of stuff. This doesn't go onto the shoe material. Did he do that?
No, we had a customer that came in and did that one time.
This stuff goes on the outboard shoe. You don't put it on the inboard shoe because the inboard shoe's got pressure against it from the piston. But you put this against the outboard shoe down underneath these fingers right here because this outboard shoe is just long for a ride. And that stops all the chuckling. And you can take all these damn silencer springs off and you don't have these things binding up on you. Okay? Now if you convert over to this brake package or any brake package, the inboard shoe is going to really thermally expand. And I'm going to show you one trick that you need to do with this shoe. The shoe kind of looks a little bit like this with the material in the center. Okay? And this is the area right here that it rides on those adapter fingers. You always want to put some high temperature type grease in there, okay? But the shoe, for the most part, is going to expand laterally. It's going to expand this way. It's not going to expand this way or back and forth. It's going to expand laterally. So what you're going to do is, anytime you do a brake job, put this thing in a vise and get a little flat bastard file, and you're going to sit there only on this back side, and you're going to cut about 10 thousandths, really a paint off on each side right here. Don't cut this, but only cut the back side right here, about 10 thousandths, maybe 20 thousandths, so that when it thermally expands, it doesn't bind. The outboard shoe is just long for the ride. You don't have to do nothing. It just sits there, but the inboard shoe is the one that floats. Okay, that floats with the piston. So make sure that you do that. Any question on brakes? Let's go drag stripping. Thank you, guys.
Okay.